The park was alive with the sounds of children laughing, dogs barking, and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. It was one of those warm afternoons when families gathered to soak in the sunshine, and the world seemed a little brighter. In one corner of the park, a little girl sat quietly on a bench, her small wheelchair parked beside her. Her eyes sparkled as she watched the other kids play, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a book she always carried. She looked like she belonged to a story herself, full of dreams and hope, even in the face of challenges most her age couldn't imagine. A few feet away, her father stood under the shade of a tall oak tree, keeping a watchful eye on her while pretending to scroll through his phone. He was always nearby, not because she needed constant help, but because the world wasn't always kind. Today, the park seemed peaceful, a small bubble where everyone could forget their worries for a while. But that bubble didn't last long. Two officers, dressed in crisp uniforms and dark sunglasses, entered the park, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. They weren't just patrolling, their rigid posture and scanning eyes gave the impression they were looking for something or someone. People glanced at them briefly, then returned to their activities, hoping not to draw attention. The officers' eyes locked on the little girl. Without hesitation, they approached her, their boots crunching against the gravel path. Her father noticed immediately, his body tensing as he put his phone away and took a step closer. The girl, too young to sense the tension, greeted them with a polite smile, her innocence shielding her from the weight of what was about to happen. "Is she yours?" one of the officers barked, not bothering with pleasantries. The question was directed at her father, but the tone made it feel more like an accusation. He nodded, his voice steady but firm. "Yes, she's my daughter." "Is there a problem?" The second officer stepped closer, towering over both of them. "We got a report about suspicious activity involving a child matching her description. Mind explaining why you're here?" The father's brows furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "Suspicious activity?" "She's a kid in a park. What could possibly be suspicious about that?" The officers exchanged a look, their expressions unreadable behind their sunglasses. One of them pulled out a notepad, as if taking notes would somehow justify their actions. "We're just following up on a report. Mind if we ask her some questions?" The little girl, sensing the sudden shift in mood, clutched her book tighter and looked up at her father. He crouched down beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "She's just a child," he said, his voice louder now, directed at the officers. "There's no need for this." One officer let out a sharp breath, clearly impatient. "We're not accusing her of anything. Just routine questions." The girl's lips trembled, and she looked at her father, unsure of what she had done wrong. "Daddy, did I do something bad?" she asked in a small voice, her words tugging at the heartstrings of anyone within earshot. "No, baby," he said firmly, his voice softening only for her. "You didn't do anything wrong." The officers, either oblivious to the growing discomfort or indifferent to it, continued to press. They asked her name, her age, why she was there, and where she lived, all questions that seemed harmless on the surface but felt invasive under the circumstances. The father tried to keep his composure, but his patience was wearing thin. "She's just here to enjoy the park like everyone else. You've got your answers. Can we go now?" But the officers weren't done. They began to circle the pair, their voices growing sharper, their questions more pointed. To anyone watching, it was clear this wasn't just about a report. There was something else driving their behavior, something unspoken but painfully obvious. People in the park began to notice the scene unfolding. Parents subtly pulled their children closer. Joggers slowed down, pretending to tie their shoes while sneaking glances. The air grew heavier, charged with silent judgment and unspoken questions. Why were they targeting a little girl in a wheelchair? What could she possibly have done to deserve this kind of scrutiny? The officers weren't paying attention to the growing audience. They were too focused on asserting their authority, on proving something no one else could see. But what they didn't realize was that someone was watching someone who wasn't just a passive observer. At the edge of the park, near the entrance, a figure stood partially hidden by the shadows of a large tree. They had arrived just moments earlier and had been quietly taking in the scene. Their presence was unassuming, but their gaze was sharp, taking in every detail: the trembling girl, the tense father, the overbearing officers. And as the situation escalated, they began to move closer, their steps deliberate, their expression unreadable. The father, now visibly frustrated, stood up to face the officers directly. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You've made your point. We're leaving." But as he reached for the wheelchair, one of the officers placed a hand on his arm, stopping him in his tracks. "Not so fast," the officer said, his tone laced with authority. "We need to verify your story." The father yanked his arm away, his jaw tightening. "Verify my story? She's my daughter. What more do you need?" The girl's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for her father's hand. "Daddy, I want to go home," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. And that's when the figure from the shadows stepped forward. They weren't dressed in a uniform, and they didn't carry a badge. But the way they walked, the way they held themselves, commanded attention. Heads turned as they approached, the crowd parting like water to let them through. The officers noticed them too, their postures stiffening as the figure closed the distance. "Is there a problem here?" the figure asked, their voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. The officers hesitated, glancing at each other before responding. "Just following up on a report," one of them said, his tone defensive. The figure raised an eyebrow, their gaze shifting from the officers to the little girl, then to her father. They didn't say anything for a moment, letting the silence speak louder than words. Finally, they turned back to the officers. "A report about a child in a wheelchair enjoying a day at the park?" they asked, their voice laced with quiet skepticism. The officers bristled, clearly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "We're just doing our job," one of them muttered. The figure took a step closer, their eyes never leaving the officers. "Your job," they said slowly, "is to serve and protect. Not to harass innocent children and their families." The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, began to murmur in agreement. The father, still holding his daughter's hand, looked at the figure with a mix of relief and gratitude. The officers shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had lost control of the situation. "We didn't mean any harm," one of them said, though the words rang hollow. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they crouched down to the little girl's level, offering her a warm smile. "Are you okay?" they asked gently. The girl nodded hesitantly, her tears beginning to dry. "I just want to go home," she said softly. The figure stood up and turned back to the officers. "I think you've done enough for today," they said firmly. "It's time for you to leave." The officers hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly stepped back, muttering something under their breath as they walked away. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of relief. As the figure turned to leave, the father called out. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The figure nodded but didn't say anything, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as they had appeared. But as they walked away, the officers exchanged a look, their expressions darkening. This wasn't over, not for them. And though the little girl and her father didn't know it yet, the events of that day were only the beginning. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the park slowly emptied. Families packed up their picnics, and children whooped and laughed as they were rounded up by their parents. The little girl and her father remained near the bench, lingering despite everything that had happened. She was quiet now, staring down at her book, though she hadn't turned a page in what felt like forever. Her father sat next to her, his arms resting on his knees, head bowed, lost in thought. "Daddy," she finally said, breaking the silence between them. "Why were they so mad at me?" Her voice was small but steady, The kind of question that didn't come from a place of fear, but from an innocent heart trying to make sense of something that didn't. Her father hesitated, searching for the right words, but even as he opened his mouth to respond, he knew there wasn't a simple answer. They weren't mad at you, he said, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Sometimes people, they just don't understand things, and they make bad decisions. The little girl tilted her head, looking up at him. But I didn't do anything wrong. He turned to her then, his eyes filled with warmth and a deep sadness. I know, sweetheart. You didn't. None of this is your fault. That seemed to satisfy her for the moment, and she went back to running her fingers along the edge of her book. But her father's mind was far from settled. He glanced around the park, his eyes lingering on the spot where the officers had stood. Even now, hours later, he could feel the weight of their stares, the sharpness of their words. And though they were gone, the memory of what had happened refused to fade. As he replayed the encounter in his head, something gnawed at him, a feeling that there was more to the story than what he had seen. Those officers hadn't just been patrolling, they had been looking for someone. And the way they zeroed in on his daughter, as though she were a threat. It didn't add up. He couldn't shake the feeling that the report they'd mentioned was just an excuse, a pretext for something else entirely. His thoughts were interrupted when a soft voice spoke behind him. Excuse me? He turned to see a young woman standing a few feet away. She had been part of the crowd earlier, watching from a distance as the scene unfolded. Now she looked nervous, clutching her phone in one hand and glancing around as though making sure no one was listening. I saw what happened, she said, stepping closer. I wanted to say I'm sorry. It wasn't right, what they did. Her father gave a small nod, appreciating her words but unsure of what else to say. Thank you, he replied simply. The woman hesitated, then added, I recorded it. Just in case you might need it. Her words hung in the air for a moment, and he felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, anger, and a flicker of something else. Hope, maybe. He hadn't even thought about what would come next, about what he could or should do. But having a recording changed things. It gave him something solid, something undeniable. Can you send it to me? He asked. She nodded quickly, holding out her phone. As they exchanged information, she lowered her voice and glanced over her shoulder again. I've seen them before. Those officers, she said, almost whispering. This isn't the first time they've done something like this. His chest tightened at her words. What do you mean? She shifted uncomfortably, as though unsure how much she should say. They've been around here a lot lately. Always looking for someone, or something. But it's never clear what. And they always seem to pick on people who can't really fight back. Her words sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just him, then. This was a pattern, a deliberate targeting of the vulnerable. And for some reason, today, they had chosen his daughter. Thank you, he said. Again, his voice firm this time. I appreciate you telling me. The woman nodded, offering a faint smile before walking away, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more. He glanced at his phone, now holding the video she had sent. He hadn't watched it yet. Part of him didn't want to relive the moment, but he knew it was important. It was a piece of the puzzle, a step toward understanding why this had happened and what he could do about it. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, he turned to his daughter. Let's head home, okay? She nodded, and he pushed her wheelchair down the gravel path, his mind still racing. But even as they left the park behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. At home, the atmosphere was quieter, but the weight of the day lingered. The little girl had fallen asleep early, her small body curled under a blanket with her book tucked close to her chest. Her father sat at the kitchen table, his phone in front of him. He hadn't touched it since they'd gotten back, hadn't opened the video. But now, as the house settled into silence, he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. Taking a deep breath, he pressed play. The video started with the officers approaching his daughter, their voices sharp and accusatory. It was strange, watching it from an outsider's perspective, seeing the tension and fear he had felt so vividly captured on the screen. But what struck him most wasn't the officers' words or actions, it was the faces in the crowd. The way people had watched, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort to quiet outrage. They had seen it too. They had known it was wrong. And then there was the figure who had stepped in, the person who had confronted the officers and forced them to back down. Their face was clearer now, their calm demeanor unmistakable. But who were they? And why had they intervened? He paused the video, staring at the figure on the screen. Something about them felt familiar, but he couldn't place it. And as he sat there, trying to make sense of it all, his phone buzzed out. It was a message, from a number he didn't recognize. Be careful. They don't like being challenged. The words sent a jolt through him, his heartbeat quickening. He stared at the message, his mind racing. Who had sent it? And what did they mean by they? Was it the officers? Someone else? His first instinct was to ignore it, to dismiss it as a prank or a mistake. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The day's events had already proven that much. He typed a response, his fingers trembling slightly. Who is this? What do you know? For a long moment, there was no reply. Just as he was about to give up, another message appeared. You're not the first. And you won't be the last. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words. The weight of what had happened today, of what he had been dragged into, suddenly felt much heavier. He wasn't just dealing with a random encounter or a misunderstanding. This was bigger. Much bigger. He glanced at the video again, at the figure who had stepped in to help. Maybe they had answers. Maybe they knew what was really going on. But how could he find them? He didn't even know their name. As he sat there, his mind churning with questions, a soft voice broke through his thoughts. Daddy? He turned to see his daughter standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the hallway light. She rubbed her eyes sleepily, clutching her blanket. Why are you still awake? He asked gently, forcing a smile. She shuffled over to him, leaning against his leg. I had a bad dream, she whispered. He picked her up, holding her close. It's okay, baby, he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Daddy's here. As he carried her back to bed, he made a silent promise to himself. Whatever was going on, whoever was behind it, he would protect her. No matter what it took. But deep down, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. And the truth, whatever it was, would change everything. The next morning, the father woke with a heaviness in his chest, the kind that made it hard to breathe. The events of the previous day hung over him like a dark cloud. He knew he couldn't let it go, couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. His daughter deserved better than that. Every child did. As she ate breakfast, her legs swinging idly under the table, he couldn't help but watch her, marveling at her resilience. Despite everything, she was smiling again, talking about her plans for the day as though the weight of what had happened hadn't touched her. But he knew better. Kids were strong, yes, but they weren't immune to the world's ugliness. She needed him to be strong for her now, even if he didn't have all the answers. After she was settled with her art supplies in the living room, he returned to the kitchen and picked up his phone. The video was still there, and so was the cryptic text from the night before. He stared at the messages for a long time, debating whether to respond again. A part of him wanted to ignore it, to push it aside and focus on his family. But another part of him, a deeper, louder part, knew he couldn't. He typed a single word and hit send. Why? The reply came almost instantly. Because they think no one is watching. His heart pounded as he read the message. It wasn't just about him, or his daughter. This was bigger, just like the woman in the park had said. These officers weren't just acting on a whim. They were part of something larger, something that thrived in the shadows. And whoever was texting him knew more than they were letting on. The messages kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. They've been doing this for years. Targeting the vulnerable. They count on fear and silence. He stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Fear and silence. That's what they relied on. But he wasn't afraid anymore. And he wouldn't stay silent. Later that afternoon, as his daughter napped, he made a decision. He would find the person who had stepped in at the park. They had risked themselves to help, and he needed to understand why. More importantly, he needed their help. The video alone wouldn't be enough to stop this. He needed to know the truth. It wasn't easy, tracking them down. He watched the video over and over, analyzing every detail, every face in the crowd. He scrolled through community forums and local social media groups, searching for any mention of the incident. It took hours, but eventually, he found what he was looking for: a photo of the figure from the park, standing outside a community center. He didn't waste any time. As soon as his daughter was awake and occupied, he set out for the address listed under the photo. The community center was small, tucked away in a quiet part of town. Inside, the air buzzed with activity, people chatting, children laughing, and the faint hum of a coffee machine. He spotted the figure almost immediately, sitting at a table near the window. They were hunched over a stack of papers, their focus intense. As he approached, they looked up, their expression shifting from curiosity to recognition. "I thought you might come," they said, gesturing for him to sit. He hesitated for only a moment before taking the seat across from them. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "A concerned citizen," they replied simply. "Someone who doesn't like seeing people get hurt." "That's not enough," he said, shaking his head. "I need to know what's really going on. Why did those officers target my daughter? Why have they been harassing people?" The figure leaned back, their expression serious. "Because they can. And because no one stopped them." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had suspected as much, but hearing it said so plainly made it feel even more real. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling with equal parts anger and determination. The figure's gaze hardened. "We expose them." They slid a folder across the table, its contents spilling slightly onto the surface. Photos, documents, even more videos, evidence of a pattern that stretched back years. As he flipped through the pages, his stomach turned. This wasn't just about a few bad encounters. This was systemic, deliberate, and deeply entrenched. "They've been targeting people who they think won't fight back," the figure explained. "The disabled, the homeless, people without resources. They think they're invisible. But they're not," he said, his voice firm. "Not anymore." The figure nodded, a flicker of a smile crossing their face. "That's why I stepped in. I saw what was happening and knew I couldn't stay silent. But it's not enough for one person to speak up. It has to be all of us." As they talked, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The officers weren't acting alone. There were others, higher up, who were complicit. And they were counting on the fact that no one would dig too deep, that people would be too afraid or too tired to push back. But they hadn't counted on him. Or his daughter. By the time he left the community center, his mind was racing. He had the evidence now, and he had allies. But he also knew the risks. If they went public with this, they would be painting targets on their backs. The officers wouldn't take it lying down, and neither would the people protecting them. As he walked home, his phone buzzed again. Another message, this one from the same unknown number. "They're watching. Be careful." He paused in his tracks, his pulse quickening. He glanced around, scanning the street for anything out of the ordinary. But everything looked normal, too normal. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that someone was keeping tabs on him. When he got home, he double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before sitting down at the kitchen table. His daughter was in her room, humming softly as she played with her toys. The sound was a reminder of what he was fighting for, of why he couldn't back down. But as the hours passed, the weight of what he was doing began to sink in. He was standing up against something much larger than himself, something powerful and dangerous. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. That evening, the father sat in the dimly lit kitchen, staring at the folder from the community center. He had read and reread the documents, each one more chilling than the last. The officer's misconduct wasn't isolated, it was a pattern spanning years, affecting dozens of families like his own. The system had allowed it to fester, shielded by layers of bureaucracy and silence. The weight of it all made his chest tighten. He had wanted to fight back, to protect his daughter and ensure this never happened again, but now the enormity of the task felt suffocating. A sudden knock at the door broke the silence. His heart leapt, and for a moment he froze. It was too late for casual visitors. He glanced toward the hallway where his daughter's room was, her quiet humming now replaced by soft snores. Rising slowly, he moved to the door, his pulse hammering in his ears. Through the peephole, he saw a figure in a hoodie, their face obscured by shadows. He hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn away, to stay silent. But the figure knocked again, more urgently this time. Swallowing his fear, he cracked the door open just enough to see them clearly. "I need to talk to you," the person said in a low voice. It was the figure from the park, the one who had intervened during the confrontation. Their hood was pulled low, but there was no mistaking the intensity in their eyes. He opened the door wider, motioning for them to come in. "What are you doing here?" "It's not safe." "I know," they replied, stepping inside and pulling off the hood. Their face was tense, their gaze darting toward the windows as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "But you need to see this." They held out a flash drive, their hand trembling slightly. "This is bigger than either of us thought. It's not just about those officers or even the city. It goes higher." He stared at the flash drive, the weight of their words sinking in. "Higher? What do you mean?" "They're protecting someone," the figure said, their voice barely above a whisper. "Someone with influence. That's why they've gotten away with it for so long. I stumbled across something I wasn't supposed to see, and now they're watching me too." His stomach twisted. The implications were staggering. If what they were saying was true, then exposing the truth wouldn't just be dangerous, it could be deadly. But before he could respond, the figure's phone buzzed. They glanced at the screen, their expression darkening. "They know I'm here," they muttered, shoving the phone back into their pocket. "You need to be careful. They'll come after you too." He followed their gaze toward the window, where the faint glow of headlights appeared in the distance. His blood ran cold. "What do we do?" The figure stepped back toward the door, their movements hurried. "Get this to someone who can make it public. A journalist, a lawyer, anyone who can't be silenced. But don't trust anyone easily. They'll try to discredit you, to bury this." Before he could protest, they slipped out into the night, disappearing as quickly as they had come. He stood frozen, clutching the flash drive like a lifeline. His mind raced with questions, but there was no time for answers. The headlights were growing brighter, the sound of an engine now audible. He quickly locked the door and turned off the lights, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Peering out through the curtains, he saw a dark car idling across the street. It didn't belong to any of his neighbors, and its presence felt wrong, ominous. He grabbed his phone, debating whether to call the police, but a sick realization stopped him. He couldn't trust them, not after what he had seen, not after what he knew. Instead, he typed out a message to a friend he knew worked in media, someone he hoped could help. But as his finger hovered over the send button, a loud knock echoed through the house. This time, it wasn't the quiet urgency of an ally. It was forceful, commanding, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He crept toward the door, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might give him away. Through the peephole, he saw two men in suits, their expressions cold and unyielding. Mr. One of them began, his voice muffled by the door. "We need to speak with you. It's about a matter of great importance." He didn't answer, didn't move. Every instinct screamed that opening the door would be a mistake. The men exchanged a glance, their patience clearly wearing thin. "We know you're in there," the other one said, his tone sharper now. "You've come into possession of something that doesn't belong to you. We're here to retrieve it." His grip on the flash drive tightened. They knew. Somehow, they already knew. Panic clawed at his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He backed away from the door, moving as quietly as he could toward his daughter's room. She was still asleep, her small form curled under the blanket. He hesitated for a moment, his resolve hardening. Whatever happened, he couldn't let them drag her into this. He tucked the flash drive into his pocket and gently shook her awake. "Sweetheart, we need to go," he whispered, keeping his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. She blinked up at him, her confusion evident, but she didn't argue. He grabbed her jacket and shoes, helping her into them as quickly as he could. Outside, the men were still knocking, their voices growing louder. With his daughter in his arms, he slipped out the back door, the cool night air biting at his skin. He moved quickly but carefully, sticking to the shadows as he made his way toward the car parked in the alley behind their house. He had to get her somewhere safe, somewhere far away from whatever was happening. As he drove, his hands clenched the wheel, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. The dark car from earlier was nowhere to be seen, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. His daughter sat quietly in the back seat, clutching her stuffed animal tightly. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Somewhere safe," he replied, forcing a smile. "I promise." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if they were true. As he drove into the night, the air seemed thick with tension, every shadow along the road a potential threat. His daughter dozed in the back seat, clutching her stuffed animal tightly, unaware of the danger surrounding them. He didn't know where to go, but he knew he couldn't stop. Every few moments, he checked the rearview mirror, expecting headlights to appear. The flash drive felt like a heavy weight in his pocket, its contents too dangerous to abandon but too risky to keep. The car's fuel gauge dipped lower with each passing mile. He pulled off the main road into a small, quiet town, hoping to find a gas station and regroup. The streets were eerily empty, the quiet amplifying his unease. A flickering streetlight illuminated an old diner on the corner. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a weak glow. Against his better judgment, he decided to stop. He parked in the shadows, carefully locking the car before stepping inside. The diner was nearly empty, save for an elderly waitress behind the counter and a man in a booth at the far end. He ordered coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he paid. The waitress gave him a curious look but said nothing, her smile kind but wary. As he sat, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his friend, the journalist he had contacted earlier. "I'm on my way," the message read. "Meet me at the old train station outside of town. Don't trust anyone else." His stomach churned. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but his options were few. He quickly finished his coffee and left a generous tip before heading back to the car. His daughter stirred as he climbed into the driver's seat, her voice groggy but concerned. "Are we safe now?" she asked, her wide eyes meeting his in the rearview mirror. "Almost," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Just a little farther." The train station was abandoned, its crumbling facade a relic of another time. Weeds grew between the cracked pavement, and the air was heavy with the scent of rust and decay. He parked behind an overgrown bush and carried his daughter inside, keeping to the shadows. The journalist was waiting, a small flashlight in hand. I wasn't followed, they assured him, though their voice carried a hint of doubt. Do you have it? He hesitated, glancing around the empty station. How do I know I can trust you? The journalist sighed, their expression weary. You don't. But if you want the truth to come out, you don't have a choice. This isn't just about you anymore. Reluctantly, he handed over the flash drive, his fingers lingering on it for a moment before letting go. The journalists slipped it into their pocket, their gaze hardening. I'll get this to someone who can broadcast it. But you need to disappear at least for now. Before he could respond, a sharp noise echoed through the station. His daughter clutched his arm, her fear palpable. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and drawing closer. He pushed her behind a pillar, his heart pounding as the journalists switched off the flashlight. Stay quiet, they whispered. A beam of light swept through the station, cutting through the darkness. A voice called out, its tone cold and commanding. We know you're here. Come out, and this will go easier for you. The journalist motioned for him to stay hidden, then stepped into the open. I'm unarmed, they shouted, their hands raised. I don't know what you're looking for, but I'm just a reporter. The officers stepped into view, their faces shadowed by the glare of their flashlights. We're not here for you, one of them said, his voice dripping with disdain. Hand over the evidence, and you can walk away. I don't have anything, the journalists lied, their voice steady. The officer's gaze hardened. We'll see about that. Before they could move, a loud noise echoed through the station, a sharp, metallic clatter. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the source. The father seized the opportunity, grabbing his daughter and darting toward the exit. The officers shouted, their voices drowned out by the sound of his pounding heartbeat. He ran through the overgrown yard, his daughter clinging to him as the train station receded into the distance. A car screeched to a halt nearby, its headlights blinding. For a horrifying moment, he thought they'd been caught. But as the driver's side door opened, relief flooded through him. It was the figure from earlier, the one who had given him the flash drive. Get in! They shouted. He didn't hesitate, bundling his daughter into the back seat before climbing in himself. The car sped off, leaving the station and the chaos behind. The figure glanced at him in the rearview mirror, their expression grim. They won't stop, they said. Not until they get what they want. I gave it to a journalist, he replied, his voice shaky. They'll get it out. The figure shook their head. It's not that simple. They'll do everything they can to suppress it. You need a backup plan. As the car hurtled down the dark road, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. Even with the flash drive in safe hands, the fight was far from over. But then, his daughter's small voice broke through his thoughts. Dad, I took this before we left, she said, holding up her tablet. On the screen was a video, clear, damning, and impossible to refute. It showed the officers in the park, their actions captured in vivid detail. His breath caught in his throat. She had been recording the entire time. The figure let out a low whistle. Smart kid. That might just be enough. For the first time in hours, a flicker of hope sparked in his chest. They had a chance not just to survive, but to fight back. The truth was out there now, and no amount of intimidation could erase it. But even as he clung to that hope, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The car sped through the quiet streets, the tablet with the incriminating video resting in the father's lap. He couldn't stop glancing back at his daughter, her wide eyes watching him with a mixture of trust and fear. She had been so brave, capturing the evidence they needed. He reached over and squeezed her hand, his voice soft. You've done something incredible. I'm so proud of you. The figure driving glanced at the father, their expression a blend of determination and worry. We need to get this video uploaded before they catch up. Somewhere public, where it can spread fast. Once it's out there, they can't take it back. The father nodded, his mind racing. There's a library in the next town. It has computers and free Wi-Fi. The driver gave a sharp nod, turning down a side road to avoid the main highway. The car moved swiftly but cautiously, the tension in the air thick enough to feel. They all knew time was against them. Every second they stayed in one place or hesitated, the chances of being caught increased. They pulled into the library's empty parking lot just as dawn began to break. The father carried his daughter in one arm, the tablet clutched tightly in the other. The building was quiet, its glass doors reflecting the soft pink hues of the morning sky. The driver kept watch near the entrance, scanning for any signs of approaching danger. Inside, the father quickly found a computer and connected to the internet. His fingers trembled as he navigated to a popular video sharing platform. The footage was raw, unedited, but that was part of its power. It was real, undeniable. As he clicked upload, his heart pounded in his chest. The progress bar crept forward, every percentage point feeling like an eternity. He glanced over his shoulder at his daughter, who stood quietly beside him. Her small hand rested on his arm, her touch grounding him. "It's going to be okay," she said softly, her voice filled with a conviction that belied her age. "People will see it, and they'll know the truth." The upload completed, and the video went live. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the father let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was done. The truth was out there, beyond the reach of those who wanted to bury it. The driver entered the library, their expression serious. "We need to move. Once they realize what you've done, they'll come after you harder than ever." The father nodded, gathering his daughter in his arms. "Where can we go?" "There's a safe house," the driver replied. "People who believe in the same fight. They'll protect you until things calm down." As they left the library, the father's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message notification. Pulling it out, he saw that the video was already gaining traction. Comments flooded in, some expressing shock, others outrage. People were sharing it, amplifying its reach. The truth was spreading faster than he had dared to hope. The drive to the safe house was long and quiet, the tension in the car gradually giving way to a tentative sense of relief. The father leaned his head back against the seat, exhaustion catching up with him. His daughter rested against his side, her small frame relaxed for the first time in what felt like days. When they arrived at the safe house, it was nestled deep in the woods, hidden from prying eyes. The people inside welcomed them with open arms, their kindness a balm to the father's frayed nerves. They offered food, blankets, and a place to rest. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to exhale. As the hours passed, news of the video continued to spread. It was picked up by major outlets, the footage played on repeat as anchors debated the implications. Protests erupted in cities across the country, people demanding accountability and justice. The officers in the video were suspended pending an investigation, their faces plastered across every screen. But it wasn't just about the officers anymore. The video had ignited a larger conversation, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the treatment of the vulnerable. It was a movement, bigger than any one person. In the days that followed, the father and his daughter stayed in the safe house, watching the events unfold from a distance. He felt a complicated mix of emotions: relief that the truth was out, fear for what might come next, and a quiet pride in his daughter's courage. She had shown more strength and clarity in those critical moments than he could have ever imagined. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of the safe house, his daughter turned to him. "Do you think things will really change now?" He looked at her, his heart swelling with both love and hope. "I think we've taken the first step. Change takes time, but it starts with people like you, people who are brave enough to do what's right, even when it's hard." She nodded thoughtfully, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of gold and amber. It felt like a promise, a reminder that even the darkest nights end with the light of a new day. In the weeks that followed, the father began to see the ripple effects of their actions. The journalist who had been at the train station wrote a series of powerful articles, shedding light on systemic issues that had long been ignored. The driver who had helped them that night became an advocate, using their platform to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced. And the father? He found a new purpose in the midst of the chaos. He became a voice for change, speaking at events and sharing his story. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. But he kept going, driven by the knowledge that his actions had made a difference not just for himself, but for countless others. As for his daughter, she continued to inspire him every day. Her strength and compassion were a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. Together, they faced an uncertain future with hope in their hearts, knowing that they had already overcome so much. The video, now viewed by millions, became a symbol of resilience and the power of truth. It was a reminder that even in the face of injustice, ordinary people could make an extraordinary impact. And though the road ahead was long, the father and his daughter knew they were not alone. They had each other, and they had a world that was finally beginning to listen.